Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Missionary Life. I'm so excited to be here with you all today. And I'm very happy to have Amanda Held Opelt here with me. Amanda is the author of A Hole in the World, Finding Hope in Rituals of Grief and Healing. She also spent 15 years as a humanitarian worker with NGOs in war zones. And the focus of this episode today is to talk about how we can grieve well and what rituals we can use to navigate through that grief, as well as finding ways that grief and joy can coexist together. And the reason I feel this is so vital for missionaries is that we experience a great deal of trauma, loss, grief, disappointment on the field that we need to fully heal from in order to complete our mission. And so I'm going to also just share a little bit more about Amanda. She has quite the the bio here. She's author, speaker, songwriter, and she writes about faith, grief, creativity. And she's written for Christianity Today, Premier Christianity, and 100 Days in Appalachia. She lives in the mountains of Boone, North Carolina, with her husband and two young daughters. And you can find her at Amanda heldopelt.com or Instagram at Amanda
Hi,
Held
it's so
Opelt.
nice to
And
be
hi,
here. Thanks for
Amanda.
having me.
Yes, it's such an honor to have you here. As I mentioned to you, I'm such a
Thank you.
great admirer of your work and also your sister's work. Rachel Held Evans
Mm,
was very formative for me when I was going through my
I'm glad to hear
deconstruction of
that.
faith. So
Yeah, thank you.
let's jump right in. So, Amanda, I really loved this beautiful quote you wrote in A Hole in the World. So I'm just going to read that now. Grief is like water, it follows gravity. It finds the lowest part of you and hollows it out even more. It exploits your weaknesses. Grief goes where it wants, with or without an invitation. It seeps into the empty spaces. It cannot be harnessed, redirected, at least not easily. It branches out from headwaters of the main event into hundreds of tributaries. Few areas
Mm,
of your life remain untouched.
thank you.
Wow, that's so beautiful. Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about your personal
Yeah.
story with grief and how you learned to experience grief
Yeah.
through Jesus's
Yeah, it's interesting.
perspective?
I kind of thought, even though I had led a pretty trauma-free life in the sense that I grew up with a lot of privilege and very stable parents and not a lot of death in my early life, we were all pretty healthy. We were all, just very solidly middle to lower middle class and doing fine and everything was going well. But I kind of thought that I knew everything there was to know about grief and trauma because I had kind of spent most of
Mm,
my career working in contexts where there were high levels of trauma. I always like to clarify, I wasn't like a proper aid worker myself in the sense that I was not the person that was delivering the aid. My role was always to do staff care
right.
for people living and working in the field, listening
Hmm.
to their stories, helping them build skills for resilience, connecting them to clinical counselors. And I also worked at a nonprofit in an urban context, working with underemployed women struggling with generational poverty and so many of the deprivations that are associated with that and limited access to resources and
Yeah.
traumatic lack of access, if you're asking me to say it bluntly. And so I kind of felt like, well, I've worked
Hmm.
with women who have been traumatized. I've worked with aid workers who have been traumatized. I've worked in contexts, high epidemic, famine, warfare type of context. I've been to these places. I've seen what,
Hmm.
disaster zones look like. So I know what grief is. I know what loss is. I know what trauma is. But I'll tell you, when you experience it personally in your life, it's a totally different experience.
Hmm.
And what that story was for me was that, over the course of about 3 to 4 years, I lost a grandparent who was very close to me. I had 3 pregnancy losses,
Hmm.
and then the atom bomb that went off in my life was that my only sibling, my older sister, who really was my true north in my life, the person that had always been there, that I'd always looked up to, she died
Hmm.
very suddenly after a bad bout of the flu. And so no warning, no, she had been perfectly healthy. She had an 11-month-old and a 3-year-old. There was no sense that anything bad was going to happen. And so when that happened, I felt like a complete novice when it comes to grief and traumatic loss, even though I'd
Hmm.
had, on paper, I had all this experience. And so what that kind of, forced me to do was lean into my faith. I mean, this is what I'd always heard you do when you experience trials and suffering, is you lean into your faith. But what that really meant for me was relearning my faith as a griever, relearning my faith as a sufferer, and rereading the Bible. I actually read through the Bible cover to cover shortly after my sister died, and seeing scripture as, through the lens of grief. I feel like I met a new God, a God who grieves, a God who's emotive. I think I'd always kind of pictured God as this sovereign king, sovereign Lord, very stalwart, very controlled. And it's not that he's not those things, but I learned that he's also a very emotive God. He's a dynamic God, an interactive God who is grieved when his people disobey, who is enraged at injustice, who mourns, who sings, who is jealous, who is, all of these emotions that we experience even in grief. God experiences a griever. Jesus Christ, certainly, as the God-man, in the incarnate presence of Jesus, experiences all of these ranges of emotions. And I found that to be actually very comforting, that I could be like Christ in my grief, that wasn't in opposition to the character of Christ, but that was actually in harmony with the character of Christ. I found that to be really encouraging.
Wow, thanks for sharing that, Amanda. Such a difficult thing to go through, the loss of your sister, Rachel. And can you tell me a little bit more about what those early days after her loss were like, and what were the things, the rituals, the people, the practices that got you
Yeah.
through
I
that
think
those
there's
early
a
months?
reason why we use the water metaphor a lot when we talk about grief or traumatic
Mhm.
experiences, the waves. We talk about waves of grief. I talk about grief being like water and finding those lowest spaces of you, the sense of drowning, the sense of being covered up. Because it really does. I think when you lose someone unexpectedly that had always been there, when you use it, particularly when you kind of lose them in the prime of their life in a way that you never saw coming, you do feel completely disoriented. And it did
Yeah.
remind me of these disaster zones that I had visited. I mean, shortly after she died, I think the first trip, the international trip that I took after her death, was a disaster response, responding to Hurricane Dorian, that devastated the Bahamas and devastated
Mm.
Abaco Island in particular. And just going to that island and seeing, I'd actually been there before, so I knew Abaco quite well, and seeing that the landmarks are all
Mhm.
gone. The GPS coordinates are the same, but the buildings, the trees, the home, it's all gone. It's completely disorienting. It's like waking up on on another planet. And
Yeah. And it's almost like your inner and outer worlds
yes,
kind of then match each other, right? Because the landscape is barren, and then it's almost comforting to be in a place like that, because you feel like
yeah,
it can understand you better, because when you're in the States and everybody's just going on with their lives, you feel like you're an outsider, you feel isolated. But to be in a place where other people are enduring suffering, it almost
yeah.
feels
Yeah, I remember
comforting
people
in a
asking
way.
me if I was ready to take this trip when I did, and I part of it was like, I just kind of need to get out of this whatever space that I am right now. I'm not going to go for very long. I know that I think we all have endurance limits when we do these hard trips to hard places. So I knew my limit would probably be shorter
Yes.
than it normally is. But there was something really comforting about standing amid that rubble, and in a place that I had been with my sister that was dear to both she and I. I hadn't really planned on talking about this, but we had actually been to Abaco 3 times as children, because my dad used to fill in as a pastor over the summers at this small church in this kind of remote island, which was kind of a dream for us. We didn't have a whole lot of money growing up, and so it was like this free vacation that my family got to do. But we had been to
Yeah.
Abaco. I know.
Free
I
vacation
know
to disaster
exactly.
zone,
But so it was
Bahamas.
like, to be able to go back there as an adult without her, to this place that had been so special to the two of us, there was something about seeing something in the physical world that matched my inner world. And that brings me to the second part of your question, is like, what rituals helped you? Well, I honestly found that there weren't many
Yeah.
rituals that were helping me process and absorb this new experience. And that's what kind of led me on this study to
Yeah.
write this book, A Hole in the World, about historic grief rituals, particularly Western grief rituals, because many cultures in Africa and Asia and the Middle East, those cultural practices they're still intact. They still practice grief rituals, but in the West and America,
Yes.
we don't practice them as much. And there's nothing in kind of our physical world that matches our inner world. And so I began to kind of study, well, what was it like when people would wear black for an entire year after someone died? That physical embodiment where their outer appearance matches their inner appearance. How does that help maybe? Or draping the mirrors with black cloth, or draping their, areas of their home with black cloth to kind of show the
Mhm.
darkness that they're feeling on the inside, things like that. I just began to study how does some of those rituals help with the absorbing of the new reality. And I kind of began to, honestly, that academic study is what in many ways led me to the processing of yeah, what had transpired.
Wow, that's really profound. Yeah, I remember similarly to you, I
Mm.
had several miscarriages, and so
Mm.
they were ectopic pregnancy losses and over a series of years. And so then I had infertility for 7 years before
Wow.
I had my
Wow.
miracle baby. And so I remember, after every time just feeling like the grief was just swallowing me, and I was just
Mm.
getting absorbed by it. And yeah, it was difficult because I felt like there weren't a lot of spaces in Western society where I could really
Yeah.
express my grief. I had been in Africa and Uganda
Yeah.
where the women would just wail, and they would just wail, and no one was stopping them. No one was, thinking it was uncouth or insane or anything like that. And I just remember really wanting to be able to do that, but not feeling like I had the permission, to be able to do that, because it's not, it's not,
Right.
it's frowned
Right.
upon in our society,
Yeah, it's like seen
and
as, like, if I had started just wailing aloud at my sister's funeral, people would have thought, well, she's not okay. Like, is she okay? She doesn't sound okay. Whereas I
right.
think in many other cultures today, and certainly in the past, in Ireland, I write about Irish keening, which is the practice of wailing aloud at a funeral. If you are not wailing, if you are not screaming and crying and kind of falling apart, they see that as abnormal. They see that as like, whoa, they're out of touch. Don't they know what's happened? And so just to kind of, I
Right.
don't know, think again about the ways that we've been conditioned to be stoic, the way we've been conditioned to be outwardly
Mhm.
stalwart or brave, or, have emotional fortitude, but in many ways is emotional numbness. And to say, like,
Yeah.
controlled emotional control is maybe not always the best way of being, particularly in the aftermath of grief.
Mhm. Yeah. I really enjoyed in the book, you talking
Mm-hmm.
about the practice of, Shiva, and just this sense of people just coming with food and sitting with you and just being there, silent presence, a hug, a squeeze, giving you some casserole. And I remember after our first loss, having some friends over, just sitting with me and, letting me kind of cry, and just even just telling my story, just repeating it out loud, what happened to me, was healing in a way, because it allowed me to kind of process it, what had happened to me, and
Mm.
just the shock of it all. And I remember just the gift that was of just having people sit with me, having people bring meals. And there are, I would say, only a few
Yeah.
people that know how to do that. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
most people find it very uncomfortable to sit with people in grief, or a lot of people move on very
Yeah.
quickly and kind of expect you to do the same. And so just giving myself permission to be in that space. I was grieving
Yeah.
for 2 years, meanwhile, my husband, he had to go back to work, and he was sort of back in it. And I was like, wait, you're not grieving with me. You're not in this with me. And it was really just, not only does he grieve differently from me, but life
Mm-hmm.
was
Mm-hmm.
kind of going on for him, whereas it
Yeah.
kind of stopped for me. Like my life just sort of stopped. And so I really enjoyed that practice of Shiva. Is there any other rituals you found particularly
Yeah, I think
helpful?
that I write about a ritual that's still practiced in many parts of Appalachia, the mountains of southern Appalachia and other areas of the South, called Decoration Day. And interestingly enough, and this is an anthropological study for you, but the practice traveled from the South and southern Appalachia to Liberia when you remember the big social experiment when they decided they wanted to send freed slaves back to West Africa, and there's a lot of conversation about whether or not that was right and just and all
Oh,
those
yeah.
things. But nevertheless, as that migration happened, these former enslaved people took that practice back to Liberia, and my friends who live and work in Liberia tell me about that still being practiced annually. This and essentially what it is that it's where the whole community comes together to decorate and clean and to decorate the graves of their lost loved ones. And so what you see a lot I know in most big cities, depending on where your listeners are, there's maybe one or two really massive graveyards that have,
Sorry.
this is where they put everybody when they die, this massive graveyard. Well, in Appalachia, we don't have a whole lot of
Yeah.
big open fields here because we have a lot of mountains and hills, and so they're mostly the hillsides are filled with these small family graveyards or small community graveyards, a small church community's graveyard. So almost every small church will have a graveyard. You'll see these family graveyards up on these hillsides that weren't suitable for farming, but were a place where they could put their loved ones when they died. And so every year on the calendar there's a day, and each graveyard has a different one, but it's generally sometime in the summer or early fall where the family has designated this is a day where we all come together and we clean the graves and we put flowers on them and we sing. It's often a very spiritual service. They will sing, they will share stories, and they'll have what they call dinner on the grounds, which is a meal. And it is a time of both celebration and mourning. And what I love about it is that it calls everyone together for a moment of grief, where we kind of this moment of shared humanity. We've all lost someone. It's not a funeral for one
Yeah.
person. It's almost like a reliving of a funeral for everyone. And so we note together that we are our lives are ephemeral. We are mortal, and we've lost people that we loved, and we can mourn that, but we can also share stories of the gift that those people were in our lives. We can praise God. We can pray together. We can comfort one another, and then we can celebrate that we are living and celebrate what it means to be alive. And it's funny, back in the day in Appalachia, it was also often a time of courting where like extended kinship networks and
Oh,
extended families and the whole community would come together, and young girl like teenagers would wear their best outfits because they were hoping to maybe meet someone that would
like
exactly
the
that would
wedding to the
become their
funeral.
future spouse. Like it was like mixing and mingling and all this. So it's such to me, just a fascinating cultural
Oh,
phenomenon. It's practiced a little bit differently in Liberia. It obviously kind of absorbed some of the tribal and cultural traditions that were present in Liberia, but it's still practiced annually in Liberia. There's one day out of the year where all graves are cleaned and people come and they actually speak to the dead and update their dead relatives on what happened during that year, which to me, what I love about this practice is that it serves the living. It doesn't just honor the dead, but it serves the living, and helps you process your life without that person that you love and do so communally.
yeah. That's really incredible. I wish that we had more practices like that, in the United States that we could
Yeah.
call upon in our moments of grief. I also notice in your writing, and maybe because I follow you on Instagram,
Thank you.
you live in a very beautiful area of the world in North Carolina. And I noticed that you've also talked a lot about the healing power of nature. And how has that been a part of your practices of
I think
healing?
for me, when I'm surrounded by nature, oh goodness, do we have like 3 or 4 hours? I could talk a lot about this. I'll keep it brief and say that I think nature is humbling because I look at
Mm,
for example, the blackberry bushes that we have all over the mountains here. It's this fruit of the earth that grows without any cultivation or effort of my own, and I see how
mm,
how you know this world, its existence, its beauty is not dependent on effort of my own. It's not dependent on, how hard I work or how good I am or how impressive I am. Nature goes on with or without me in it. And that's really humbling, that the ancient nature of the mountains. Geologists say that the Appalachian Mountains are some of the oldest in the world. We live right by the New River, which is not a new river at all. It may be the second oldest river in the world. And I don't know how they come up with knowing that. But just to be humbled by the longevity of the earth, I think is helpful for me to say that, like, hey, we're all, as human beings, we are all passing away, and we all, like I said before, our lives are ephemeral. This shouldn't be shocking news to us, but God and his creation last forever. And so I think there's just something very, very comforting about not being surrounded by man-made structures and kind of indicators of the hustle nature of mankind and the accomplishment-driven nature of mankind, but just the quiet, persistent longevity of nature is really comforting to me.
Wow, that's really well put. I also have found nature to be extremely healing in my journey, maybe because when I was
Mm,
grieving, it felt like I really couldn't connect to God. It felt like God was far away, and I was having
mm,
difficulty, reading
sure.
scripture through all the tears. And again, you go through, the denial, the anger, you go through all of that with God. And I
Yeah.
think that's an important part of the process, to give people permission to ask the questions of God and to be angry with God. And I found that, when I could go into nature, I would often, I remember one time we had our second loss. My husband and I just packed up
Mm,
our car. We went camping in the Trinity Alps in Northern California. And we were just out there in all this wide beauty, the blue mountains. And out there, I felt like
mm,
just more connected to God, more connected to myself, more connected to my husband. And I found that to be really healing in my journey. So I encourage people, if you're having trouble, connecting to God in your grief, that nature might
yeah.
be the
Yeah, and I
companion that
yeah, I
you.
think that's so true, that the rocks cry out, the stars testify to the goodness
Mm,
of God. And so when we have trouble accessing the truths of scripture, like you just said, and yeah, I'm so sorry for your loss and what you've gone through, and I think it totally makes sense that
thank you.
you were having, it felt hard to connect. I think that that's
Yeah.
to connect to the Lord through scripture can be really healing, or even to connect to the Lord through other people and the faith. I'm a big believer that the faith of those around us can uphold us when our faith is faltering.
Mm, yeah. Well, that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is you mentioned going through this grief process with your husband and children. And I thought you gave some beautiful examples of how to do this. And I found this would be really helpful for our listeners because oftentimes, like I said, grief can be so isolating and it can leave you feeling separated from other people. So, were there any things that you and your husband and children did together to grieve that you found to
Yeah.
be helpful in your
Yeah,
journey?
I mean, I think, oh goodness, yeah, I think going through grief, it's like, even though you've lost the same person, you're all experiencing the loss in a different way, because you lost
Yeah.
somebody. The relationship you lost was different than the relationship your mother lost or your father lost and your husband lost. And the thing
So
I
true.
didn't know about grief that no one told me is, not only are you going through the worst experience of your life, you're watching everyone you love most in the world go through the hardest experience of their life. And I remember after
Mm,
one of our miscarriages, I was kind of feeling this deep sense of betrayal by my body. Like, how come my body couldn't do this for us? How come,
mm,
like this,
yep.
I've lost this dream that I had, this child. One of our losses was at 9 or 10 weeks, so I'd already had like a month of dreaming,
Mm,
of learning to love this child,
yeah.
and feeling so, and seeing how devastated my husband was, and feeling like I'm carrying his grief too. So I'm carrying my own grief, I'm carrying his grief. And so I think one
Yep.
thing that is helpful is to remember that you really can't carry someone else's grief for them, you have to trust that the Lord is going to walk with them. I mean, this is especially true with my parents. I almost deferred my own grieving so that I could kind of, quote unquote, take care of my parents, because I just knew how devastating losing
Mm,
their daughter, my sister, was. But I had to trust the
yeah.
process for them. You have to trust the Lord not only for yourself, but trust the Lord for others, and trust that God is going to be with them. And then I think as often as you can to, I think what has been helpful for me is when my husband and I and our children would go to my sister's gravesite together and mark it together, even though we are
Hmm.
grieving in our own ways, to have moments where we mark it together, and talking. My
Yeah.
oldest child was only 9 or 10 months when my sister died, and so talking with them
Yeah.
about what happened when you were a baby, and how that may have even
Of
impacted her, even though she didn't, you think, well, she didn't remember this. But of course, what we were
course.
all going through impacted her. It impacted her development. So telling the story of
Yeah.
what happened, not being afraid to tell young children the story of what happened, has been helpful for me.
Mm, yeah, it's really beautiful. So I want to talk a little bit
Mm-hmm.
about grief and joy and the how the dichotomy of these things, we can hold, two different emotions in our hands at the same time. So we can hold the grief, the joy, the disappointment, the hope, wonder. And I really believe that we can feel all these things simultaneously. And so, can you talk a little bit about how you've learned to hold these two things in your hands and maybe any personal
Yeah.
experience you've had with that?
Yeah, I think I was actually out in the field doing a resilience training for our team that was working in Greece at the time when they were having this huge influx of refugees. And one of my
Mm,
friends that was there, who had been a missionary in Afghanistan, an aid worker in Afghanistan, she had lost one of her colleagues, had been kidnapped, and she lost her, and she was still, this is many years ago, but she was still in grief over it. And she was telling me that she pictures grief or hearts in some ways like a balloon, and that when you experience grief, it's like it expands your heart. Your heart has to expand to hold that sorrow, and that she had experienced that expansion when she lost her colleague to that kidnapping. But she said your heart
mm,
stays big like that, such that it's actually able to hold more joy, more wonder, more awe. And I have found that to be true. That
mm,
the more I lose, the greater capacity I have for love in some ways, and wonder and awe and delight, where
yeah.
I just kind of want to suck the marrow out of life, and just kind of want to, I don't know, it was strange. Like in grief, there was a time where the world was colorless and tasteless and empty, but it didn't take long for this sense in which,
Mm,
like, I felt like my senses were heightened, my taste buds came alive, like food tasted better, music sounded more beautiful, the sunsets
mm,
were more awe-inspiring. And I think it's because when you've just known what it is to be in deep pain, you cherish the joy even more, you don't take it for granted. And I think that it's like we love to just categorize our lives as either good or bad, as either grief filled or happy. And my argument now is that it's just both. You can't categorize life. I
mhm.
had this beautiful baby girl who we had dreamed and hoped for, going through that season of miscarriage and infertility. She was 10 months old, and I was literally living my best life with this dream come true when my sister died. So it was both the happiest time
Yeah.
of my life and the hardest time of my life. And I had to just kind of get comfortable somehow with the idea that it was going to be both, that I was going to experience this profound extremity of both joy and sorrow during that season.
Yeah, and it's kind of like,
Yeah.
YOLO. It's like you have to just, in a way, you have to just grasp
Mm-hmm.
hold of life and not feel
Yeah.
guilty for feeling joy again. I remember after grieving a particular loss, feeling a little bit
Yeah.
guilty when I started to feel better. Like, oh, does this mean I'm not remembering as much or not grieving as much? But you really can't let
Yeah.
yourself, feel guilty. And I remember after this, we had a loss last November. I went through IVF, and
Oh.
we lost twin embryos and had a miscarriage. And I remember maybe about a week after taking my son, my family to the beach, and just sitting on the beach, looking at the ocean, the waves, the sunset. And then my son would just kept bringing me these
Yeah.
little shells, and he just kept lining them up and down my leg. And he's like, "Look, mommy, aren't they so beautiful?" And it was just this, gosh, it makes me tear up, but it was just like this moment of, so much beauty, in the middle of so much loss. And I totally agree with what you said. It feels like my
Yeah.
heart was just cracked open to feel more love,
Yeah.
more joy, more capacity. And I think the gift that grieving gives us too is the ability to be with
Yes.
others in
Yeah.
their grief and their pain, their loss. And that's been such a gift to me because I've had, my brother-in-law, his brothers fighting in the Ukraine in the war. And, the day that we found out, I just rushed over to their house and like made a meal and just, prayed with him. And it just,
Yeah.
he was just kind of shocked. He's like, nobody really knows what to do.
Yeah.
He's like, he knew exactly the right thing to do. And it just
Yeah.
gives you this capacity to love others and to,
Yeah.
not be unmoored, by the grief, but just to jump right in and
Yes.
say, "Hey, I'm going to
Yes.
be here
Grief
with you
is
in
in
it."
so many ways an education. And it's an education where the tuition is astronomically high. but it is
Yeah.
an incredible equipping for you to be a companion to other people. It's a infertility in many
Mhm.
ways is a sisterhood, and it's not a sisterhood that you want to be part of,
It
but
is.
it's just beautiful to know you're not
Yeah.
alone. And the connections I've made with other women that have been through miscarriage have been really, really beautiful, lifelong connections
Yeah.
that I'm grateful for. And so again, that doesn't mean that I'm grateful for my miscarriages. It doesn't mean that miscarriage was a good
Right.
thing that happened because it led to all these blessings. No, it'll always be bad. Like my 3 losses will always be bad, always be
Mm.
painful. I will always categorize them
Yep.
as hard as bad. But what happened afterward was good, and it's both. It's both things, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. It's well said. So, I guess lastly, thinking about the things, the griefs that missionaries in particular face, because they are very specific, I think. There's the grief of, witnessing the suffering of others. There's the grief of poverty and trauma that you bear witness to. There's the grief sometimes of war or emergency evacuations. And like these are very specific to cross cultural work. Do you have any message you'd like to give them or permission you'd like to give them that in
Yeah.
their grieving process?
When I think about what it is to be a missionary or gosh, even a social worker or a counselor or someone working in the helping profession where you live
Yeah.
in, I always say it's like living in the suburbs of other people's trauma. You're there. You might not be the primary person, but you're there, and there's the secondary trauma or the vicarious trauma, vicarious loss and suffering that you experience.
Yes.
I think a lot about that verse in
Yeah.
Philippians 4 that says, like, I have learned the secret of being content in all circumstances, whether in plenty or in want. That word Paul uses for secret, it's like almost like a picture of a secret handshake, like this strange initiation in what it means to
Mm,
live life in both,
yeah.
in like I said, in both extremities. Because I think it's really hard as whether you're a missionary or an aid worker or a social worker, and you're going into homes where there's profound suffering, you're going into countries where there's profound suffering, and then you get to
Mm,
fly home. You get to fly home from the war zone. You get
yeah.
to come home at night to a safe home. You have the blessings that you have, the privileges you have, the advantages you have, and you may feel guilt, or you may feel like,
Yeah.
oh gosh, am I allowed to go shopping at Walmart? Am I allowed to be happy?
Mm,
And I think there is a secret to learning that way of living. I think for most people, when they hear that verse from Philippians, they think, oh yeah, it's really hard to live in difficult circumstances. I think for aid workers, for missionaries, it's hard
Mm.
sometimes to live in good circumstances because you've seen the worst. And I
Yeah,
think
that's
just
true.
learning that everything can be like God is present in both places. He's present in the joy and he's present in the sorrow. God
Mhm.
will help you. Like when we sit at the feet of our teacher, Jesus, we can learn that secret of how to be content when things are good and not feel guilty, and to receive those things as a gift
Yeah.
from God. We can learn the secret of being content when things are really, really hard and trust that God is present in the really, really hard. Being a missionary and being an aid worker, I think tempers consumerism in a way that's really good. So we know how to enjoy the
Yes, I
good
agree.
things without overindulging in them. We know how to be maybe more generous. We know how to maybe receive good things, but also to give in a very prodigal kind of way, to be, to give maybe irresponsibly because we know what it is
Yeah.
for people to not have much, and we know how to be extravagant in our gifts.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the secret. I think it takes a lot of wisdom. It's like a dance for missionaries, for aid workers, to learn how to live in plenty and how to live in want, and also to just say, like, lament the hard things that you see is a form of worship. Lament doesn't stand in
Mm.
opposition to worship. I think it is a form of worship. It is a pathway to worship
Mm.
because we're standing in agreement
That's
with
good.
God. To me, worship is any time we stand in agreement with God that things are not how they should be. This is not how it should be.
Mhm.
Image bearers of God should not suffer in this way. And so when you lament that, you're standing in agreement with God over the worth of humankind, and in hope of the redemption that is to come. And so, yeah, give yourself permission to grieve. Give yourself permission to lament. That's holy. That's
Yeah.
holy work, and it's good to do that.
Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that one of the thing that, missionaries experience is also this feeling of like, well, my suffering is not as bad as your suffering, so I'm going to
Hmm.
somehow diminish my suffering. And so sometimes, like you said, there's that guilt that, oh, well, I wasn't shot or I wasn't raped or, so how can I grieve
Yeah.
the fact that my grandmother just died? And so I think also just as missionaries, giving you the permission to
Yes.
feel all of your feelings, and that emotions are something that God gave to us as a way to connect with him, a way to connect with other people. And so just allowing yourself to feel those things and grieve them, and not just, it's really easy on the
Hmm.
field
Hmm.
to go into survival mode. And when you do that,
Yeah.
you numb out pain, but you also
Exactly.
numb
Yeah.
out, numb out joy. And so just giving you permission to stop and
Yeah.
actually lament, and not just have to, okay, got to carry on, got to go to the next thing,
Hmm. Hmm.
can't really stop and grieve that now. We actually need
Yeah.
to stop,
Yeah, it's
and
it's
we have
interesting to
to.
look at all the things Jesus cares about, the broad spectrum of things that emotionally
Mm,
moved him, everything from the death of his friend Lazarus to his friends not having enough wine at a party to to
mm.
right, that's
That would
grievous,
grieve me
man.
too.
And to children being swatted away and spoken to cynically, to a fig tree not giving him the fruit that he wanted. Jesus was moved by a wide variety of pains and sorrows, some small, some
Mm,
big, some seemingly trivial, but he was fully human, and I think we're given permission to be fully human too.
mm. Well, this has been,
Oh,
I
how
think, my
kind.
favorite
I
podcast
love
so
talking
far.
with people that are interested in how to equip people that live and work in hard environments. So I'm thrilled for the work that you're doing and very excited about your podcast.
Thank you, Amanda. That's so sweet. I'm just
Yeah.
honored that you joined me today. And so, Amanda, if people want to, I know you have a new book out. Can you tell us a little bit about that, where
Yeah,
people
so you can
can find
find
that?
both my books anywhere books are sold, Amazon, or I think they're at walmart.com. Speaking of Walmart, how many times has Walmart come up? But yeah, my most recent book is a book called Holy Unhappiness, God, Goodness, and the Myth of the Blessed Life. And it's kind of about some of the expectations we have of what the life of faith will feel like. And what does it mean when we struggle with difficult or seemingly negative emotions? Does that mean we're not as holy? Does that mean that we're failing? Does that
Mhm.
mean that God has failed? And kind of maybe trying to re examine what our definition of blessing and goodness really is. And so I hope you check that out. It was born very much out of my experience with grief, but also with some of the disillusionment I felt as a missionary. I write a lot about being a missionary in India, which is my first kind of job
Wow.
after college. And so it kind of some of the disillusionment I felt being a missionary, being an aid worker, working in nonprofit as a Christian, working in ministry, and how I dealt with that. So I think it would be
Yeah.
helpful to some of your listeners.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely, you guys have to pick it
Yes,
up.
I'm
And
on
you're also
Instagram,
on
sometimes
Instagram?
on X, formerly known as Twitter, although that place is a bit frightening. And people can find most of my work at amandaheldopelt.com.
Okay, perfect. And if you want to connect with me, you can visit me on my website, www.saritahearts.com, or find me on Instagram at saritahearts. And so, Manna, it's just, you're a delight. And I wish we lived
Yes,
closer
we
because I
we
think we'd be
should we'll
friends.
connect someday, hopefully.
I mean,
Yeah.
two people that love to talk about grief. And yeah, so thank you for this chat.
Yes, thank
And
you.
hopefully, I'll see you soon. All right.